Oh boy, what a roller coaster ride that we are on. You had the campaign season when Donald Trump was discussing how the United States was wasting a ton of money on Ukraine. Then you had Trump winning the election and on Inauguration Day discussing how Putin is in trouble. Then you have the US Russia summit. Then you had a discussion of a mineral or reconstruction deal that was going to be signed today, including Zelensky coming over to the United States and having a sit down in Washington, D.C. and the Oval Office to do so. And, well, now this. I have never seen anything like this before. It is going to be an iconic moment, and some of the faces and the expressions that you have on the president, the other president, and the vice president are going to become iconic as well. But there's a lot to discuss here beyond their own discussion, so let's get to it. Did we just see relations between America and Ukraine completely implode? Well, yes, for today. But who knows what's going to be happening 2 weeks from now? Like I just said, we are on a roller coaster ride, and I don't know where we are actually in the process of that ride. I don't know if there's another loop coming up. I don't know if we're going to have a hard turn. I don't know if there's a chain lift that's going to take us way up. I don't know if there's going to be another huge drop off. It's the type of thing that maybe we should just reconvene in 2 weeks and see where we are. And another part of the conversation that's going to be circulating in the media ecospheres is how Russia loves this. And yeah, that part is true, and we'll talk more about that later on today. But there's a deeper problem here in trying to think that this is going to map onto Russia being able to take advantage of the situation and have good outcomes in the bilateral relationship between Russia and the United States. Well, that obviously has hints of truth to it. But think about what Russia's belief is about the war right now. Russia thinks that it's doing fairly well, and that it is capable of further moving the lines west. And certainly this is going to play into that belief. But if you have the Trump administration wanting to have a peace deal done, and simultaneously Russia wanting to move the line further, thinking that they have the ability to move the line further, and now under the impression that relations between the United States and Ukraine are imploding, that's going to make Russia relatively intransigent. So it remains to be seen, and we'll find out about this, I think, pretty soon, whether Trump is actually going to have any real success on the Russia side of this coin. Watch what leaders do, not what they say. Does this still stand? Yes, absolutely, 100%. What happened in the Oval Office today is a media circus, for sure. But think about what actually went on in terms of what was done today. That is so much worse. Zelensky took a break from being a president in the middle of a war to fly from Ukraine to the United States. He does not have an abundance of time. So making that sort of time commitment means that he expects to get something good out of this. There is going to be some pleasant conversation, an agreement as it relates to some sort of mineral rights and extraction and reconstruction funds, some handshakes, some good photo ops, and then perhaps in the long run, additional support from the United States to Ukraine. And none of that looks like it's going to be happening now. If they had this bizarre conversation, and they still signed the agreement afterward, yeah, there would have been a media circus, just like what we're having now. But the actual fundamentals on the ground would not have been changed very much by that media circus. It would have driven a news cycle, but again, the fundamentals on the ground would not have shifted as a consequence of that conversation if there were arms flowing from the United States to Ukraine. So, all told, this is a harbinger of bad things, and it does, for someone who is not paying too close attention to the news, summarize just how much of a problem the United States and Ukraine have. But in terms of what the direct impact of that conversation was, that is marginal relative to the fact that there wasn't a deal signed, and Ukraine is no closer to getting weapons and support from the United States. Put differently, when I was watching it happen, I just took a deep breath and was planning to go along with the rest of my day. It wasn't until I heard that the deal was not done that I started updating my information about this being seriously concerning. So you might think to yourself, yeah, we should watch what leaders say if we think that is going to result in something that is going to happen afterward in terms of what is done. And so, these things do matter on the margins to some degree. But again, I'm really concerned when things actually are happening. That's when I start paying attention. Forcing a ceasefire by threat of conditional weapon supply and sanctions requires credibility in the commitment to actually follow through on the threats. Someone has been watching a lot of lines on maps. Do you think Trump's relative lack of commitment to any side of the conflict will throw a wrench in his peace plan for this reason? Yep. Remember, the basics of Special Envoy to Ukraine Keith Kellogg's peace plan is to offer conditional armament. Specifically, if Ukraine refuses a ceasefire, then the United States responds by cutting Ukraine's arms supply. And if Russia refuses a ceasefire, then the United States responds by massively ramping up arms assistance to Ukraine. The hard part of this is convincing Russia of the credibility of that threat. In other words, does the Kremlin actually believe that if the Kremlin rejects a ceasefire proposal because it thinks that it can keep pushing the line of control further west, that the United States and the Trump administration is actually going to follow through on increased aid to Ukraine? And certainly after the conversation in the Oval Office today, what they're thinking in the Kremlin is that, well, such conditional armament is less likely now. Now, do I believe it is still possible? Yeah. Like I said, we're on a roller coaster ride, and I don't know what's happening next. It's like we're in Space Mountain in Disneyland, and because they always have the inability to run the lights properly there, I don't know what the next turn is or the next ramp or the next drop. I don't know what's happening next. And in fact, when I woke up this morning, my expectation was that I might wait a few days until Monday or so, and then do a video about this past week of diplomacy in the White House. So we had France, we had the United Kingdom, and we had Ukraine all going through there. It looked like things were going pretty good for Ukraine, and now we have the biggest drop-off that we've seen so far. But that doesn't mean that we're just not going to ramp right back up immediately afterward. So this is, again, the type of thing that you need to ask me about in a couple of weeks. I will say this, though, and it echoes something that I've said before on the main channel. A really bad outcome for the United States is a situation where the Trump administration actually would follow through when push comes to shove, so its threat is credible, but Russia calculates that it's not credible. It gambles that the United States will not actually follow through. And if that's the case, then we end up in a situation where the United States actually has to spend the money to increase aid to Ukraine, and that is worse for the United States and worse for the Trump administration as compared to a world where the Kremlin actually believes the threat to begin with. So if I were Keith Kellogg, I would be of two minds about this. On one hand, the United States and the Trump administration is seeing what it wants from Europe right now. We are seeing the first serious signs that Europe is getting serious about increasing its military production. And insofar as what Trump has been doing in the last few months, as well as today, this is a positive sign for what the United States, or what the Trump administration more specifically, wants. But on the other hand, you still have to manipulate the Kremlin's belief, and certainly today did not help that. And I think this is overall a net negative. Yes, there are some positives, again, from the Trump administration's perspective on what Europe is doing, but I don't think that that is going to outweigh the losses as it relates to the beliefs that are forming inside of the Kremlin. Does it matter that the argument happened in front of cameras instead of behind closed doors? Yes, and I think there are some subtleties working through here. I personally would not be as worried about what this is going to do to the Western situation. And in fact, referring to the previous question, there are some benefits here in kicking Europe to get a little bit more serious about security. And I keep saying that this is a good thing from the perspective of the Trump administration, but for anyone who is concerned about free riding in the Western alliance, that should be a benefit to them as well, and that extends well past the Trump administration. It also extends well past the United States and to a lot of people that are in Europe and concerned about these sorts of things. Now that said, ask yourself for a moment, how does Ukraine win this war? How does Ukraine turn things around completely and drive Russia out of large swaths of territory that Russia, as it stands, currently has control over? Well, the way that happens is by fomenting political instability inside of Russia. I'm not just talking about this in terms of a shoot-the-moon style situation where Putin is driven from power. Even the threat that might happen, or the threat that there will be challenges to his regime, can result in Russia being a little bit more cautious about just how far it's pushing. So even if we're not talking about Russia completely retreating from Ukraine, this does matter, and not just on the margins, in terms of how much Ukrainian territory Ukraine will hold on to after the war ends. And I can tell you that this is going to, well, it already is playing on loop on Russian TV, and that's going to make it all the more difficult to create political instability inside of Russia. Anyone who is thinking about challenging the Kremlin, or the conversations that may have already been taking place inside of the Kremlin, are now going to be relatively easily quashed by just pointing to this. And again, going back to the whole don't listen to what they say, watch what they do thing, This is not just a typical piece of Kremlin propaganda. There's actual substance behind this. The conversation that took place at the White House underlied an actual deeper rift that has tangible consequences on the war. So yes, in sum, this does matter quite a bit that it happened in front of cameras and not just behind closed doors. Why didn't Trump react like that when Macron fact-checked him? Is Trump afraid of France, or is needing France in a meaningful way? Well, Trump understands the bargaining situation here, and talked about that at length today. He is bargaining from a position of strength as it relates to Ukraine. There is no arguing that. We can have a conversation about how diplomatic it is to be talking about that. We can have another conversation about how the United States may benefit from having a strong, secure Ukraine. But that doesn't change the fact that if Trump walks away from the situation, he is not going to be nearly as impacted by this as Ukraine will be. In contrast, the situation between the United States and Europe is relatively even-handed. The United States still needs Europe, and I think that this is a point that is lost in a lot of the Trump rhetoric. Or maybe more specifically, it gets lost in the sound bites that the media use when they're discussing what's going on with Trump. Trump says a lot of things, and you have to look at the larger conversation that he has when he says these sorts of things, because you'll have the bombastic comments followed by something that has some sort of logical connection to it some of the time. And when you're missing out on the second half of those statements, it doesn't really put into context what's going on with the first half. Trump really wants to make the China pivot. But at the same time, the United States cannot be in a situation where Europe is falling apart, literally and militarily, because of an invasion or something like that. Europe is a massive trading partner to the United States, and if that falls apart, then there's going to be all sorts of economic consequences in the United States, not only because the United States is not selling goods to Europe, and Europe is not selling goods to the United States, but you're also in a situation where some of those input goods, things that factories in the United States need, those things are made inside of Europe, and if Europe is not producing them and sending them to the United States across the Atlantic, then the factories in the United States are basically worthless at that point. So to succeed with that pivot to China, the United States needs Europe to ramp up defense spending. Now, at the risk of spoiling part of the main topic on Sunday's video on the main channel, think back to Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth's comments when he visited NATO headquarters a couple of weeks ago. That was another media circus, and it seems like the general takeaway that came out of that is that the United States was going to abandon Europe. But let me give you a quote from Hegseth during the same comments that inspired all of this. This is not damage control the next day. This is still within that same conversation and that same statement that Hegseth made. He said, quote, "The United States remains committed to the NATO alliance and to the defense partnership with Europe, full stop." And he's not lying about that. The vast majority of the US partners in Europe understand that, but it does mean that the United States and Europe are on a more level playing field, where it's just the United States is now supposed to be focusing on China, and Europe is supposed to be focusing on Europe. And that, in sum, is why Europe still has some bargaining power here. Given Trump's approach and behavior during the tense televised Trump-Zelensky meeting, how might other world leaders adjust their strategies when engaging with him in future high-stakes situations? Yeah, this is one of the more perplexing things that happened today. Trump says a lot of weird things, but if you look at what Trump actually does, 95% of his behavior could be summarized by seeking media attention in China. And I actually think that this is a good exercise for everyone. My life has certainly improved in trying to understand what's going on here. Whenever I see Trump pop up in the news, I pause and ask myself, 1, does this somehow increase Trump's media exposure? And 2, how does this affect China? And if I think about what's going on in the news and how it reflects those two questions, usually, 95% of the time, I have some understanding about what might actually be going on here. In this case, China is the base step. The United States, and again, Trump specifically, sees Ukraine and the war that's taking place between Russia and Ukraine as a stumbling block to making that pivot to China. And so given that, entering the conversation, Trump thinks that he's bargaining from a position of power, because in large part he is. And when he's getting involved in a conversation as tense as this one, he doesn't really mind, because he understands that this is going to generate news stories, and he loves that sort of thing. Indeed, during the conversation, he said, this is going to make for good television. And he was right. If it had not made for as good of television, I probably would not be here right now recording this video. I would not be doing this on a Friday night. I would be having fun, and I would be pushing this conversation until Monday. I spent all week preparing a 42-minute video for you guys for this weekend, and now I'm having to punt on it for a day because of what's going on here. This is not good. I don't like this. I would not like to do this. But this is the second time that something like this has happened this week between Zelensky and Trump. You may recall that Zelensky posted on X that he thought that Trump was getting his news from disinformation sources. And that was kind of poking the bear and led to the bit of the fallout that we had between the two before this press conference and media circus today. And maybe you could chalk up today with this just being what happens in the moment of a conversation where you're not stopping and really thinking about the consequences of what is going on. But something like a post on X, that is deliberate. That takes time. Someone had to sit down and type it and think to themselves, do I want to hit enter or not? And they chose to hit enter. So it seems like whoever is advising Zelensky on these issues probably needs to be reconsidering what advice is being given. Just compare this conversation to what went on with the United Kingdom earlier this week, where the Trump administration has now been offered a second state visit by King Charles, which is something that rarely ever happens. It was buttering Trump up, something that Trump likes because he likes that sort of media attention. He gets payoffs based off of that. He really enjoys that sort of thing internally. The United Kingdom was able to play that off effectively, and it seems like Zelensky and Ukraine are not doing that as well. And that goes, again, back to whoever is advising him. I'm not really sure what they're doing here. Why do people think that Russia is going to win? They will not be able to beat a mobilized Europe on any metric. Well, the question is less about winning or losing, rather how much is going to be won or lost. And Ukraine has the ability to take back a whole bunch of territory. Even though Ukraine does have manpower shortages, so does Russia. Russia has a problem recruiting people as well. What Ukraine does not have enough of to be able to do this is military support in terms of funding and in terms of armament. Just as a thought experiment here, if all of the NATO countries spent 1% of GDP funding Ukraine to fight Russia, Russia would not be able to win this. Russia would be driven back. It would be hard to take back everything in the Donbass and return to 2014 borders, and it would be even harder to retake Crimea or something like that. But if we think about just trying to return things to the status quo on February 23rd, 2022, that type of thing would be eminently possible if it were the case that the United States and Europe actually funded the situation. But the fact of the matter is, to date, the United States and Europe have not been willing to spend that amount of money on the situation, and there hasn't been put forth a politically actionable plan to do so. There's been a lot of conversation about, well, wouldn't it be nice if we increased all of our defense spending and forced Russia out of Ukraine? That'd be great. But nothing in terms of what is politically practical to actually do that. The question for today is whether what we saw in the Oval Office is the final nudge for Europe. Will Europe increase its defense spending to make up for whatever the United States is going to withdraw, or perhaps go above and beyond that precisely because Europe is so worried about the United States? That's something that we're going to have to wait and see on. Can Trump be playing 4D chess without knowing he's playing 4D chess? If there is a falling out and Europe picks up the slack, isn't that what he wanted all along? Sure is what he wanted all along, yeah. And once again, at risk of spoiling my more coherent thoughts for Sunday, Europe does not actually think that the United States is abandoning the continent. I know it seems that way in the media, and it seems that's the conversation that's being had, but when you get down to it and you ask the leaders what they think the United States will actually be doing, that's not what they believe. Now, that can be hard to parse out, because the European leaders who are most vocal about increasing European defense spending were the ones who were already hawks and wanted to do this before the Trump administration started getting serious about this. They were the ones who were serious about this during the Biden administration when Biden was being more diplomatic about it. They are very happy to point to what the Trump administration is doing and telling their constituents, look, we are on our own now. We have to do this because the United States is not going to be there for us. And the only way for us to be able to handle our situation in Europe is for us to increase our defense spending. But if you start drilling down into what they are saying a little bit more closely, when they're using the word abandonment, they are saying that precisely because it will rally the base. It will get the base of their countries to do things that were not feasible before politically. But when they are thinking of abandonment here, they are not under the impression that the United States is actually about to leave NATO or completely depart from the European continent. They understand that this is, again, the China pivot that the Trump administration is trying to undergo, and that the United States still has interests in Europe, but the United States is also going to be the one tasked with handling Indo-Pacific security matters. So these are politically savvy moves from those European leaders. And while I do not want to ascribe this as 4D chess coming out of the Trump administration, it is true that the Trump administration is getting a lot of what they want here. And it's also true, I am sure, and I've talked about this before, there are definitely going to be staff and other members of the larger bureaucracy inside of the US government, thinking about the State Department, Department of Defense, as well as, to some degree, the executive branch, that understand that this is the consequence of what Trump is saying. And for them, because they are getting most of what they want, they are not about to try to influence Trump's behavior or try to change Trump's behavior here. Can Putin just offer the same mineral deal to the United States in the conquered Ukrainian territory? Sure, he could try, but there's a big problem here. The content of the mineral deal was not about direct payments. It started like that, or at least it was reported that in the initial conversations that took place over in Europe, that the United States was demanding some very large sum of money out of Ukraine to pay back for all of the military aid that the United States has been sending to Ukraine. However, the deal that was supposed to be signed today was more of a memorandum of understanding that the United States and Ukraine would operate a joint Ukrainian reconstruction fund. And largely what the United States was going to be doing with that is using the United States companies to be able to extract the mineral wealth out of Ukrainian mines, which makes sense because Ukraine is going to have to rely on Western knowledge to be able to do that. It's going to be hard for Ukraine to be able to extract it on its own. So if Ukraine wants to be able to profit from the minerals that are in the ground, they need to extract those and then sell them on the market. And it would be helpful to have a foreign business partner come in and assist with the extraction part of that process. So even if the United States is not making money from the actual minerals that are extracted, there are still businesses that would be happy to make some money by setting up the extraction process and being paid accordingly. Now, the funny thing here is that Russia may very well also need assistance in doing that. Russia had been using a lot of US and Western assistance on oil extraction previously, and that's part of the reason why perhaps we're seeing problems with the oil supply chains coming from Russia right now. But to return to the specific question, the problem here, if Russia were to offer that same sort of deal to the United States, what US company is going to want to do that? Seriously, what US company is going to want to go in to occupied regions of Ukraine to extract mineral wealth out of those and then give that to Russia for Russia to sell on the open market? It was going to be difficult enough to convince US companies to go into formerly occupied regions of Ukraine to set up those sorts of mine extractions. Mine extraction is so expensive to start up. This is one of those things where you have to invest tons and tons of money ahead of time, and you only ultimately profit on this in the long run if there is going to be a long run of mineral wealth extracted. But lingering in the background was always going to be the possibility that Russia might restart the war, and those mines would be in danger. And that would be a really bad thing if you've been working 5 years to get your mine set up, you haven't actually started extracting anything yet, you've invested tons and tons of money in trying to do that, and ultimately all gets blown up. Or perhaps even worse, it just gets taken by Russia. And you've set all of that up for them, and you're not getting any of the profits associated with it. So, I ask one more time, what US company would want to do that? Yes, it's possible that Putin could offer the same sort of mineral deal to the United States, but I don't foresee how this is going to work out very well for US businesses. Are Rubio and Kellogg on board with Trump advances hard position on Ukraine? Well, let's take a look. Here's Senator Marco Rubio on X right after this. Thank you, POTUS, for standing up for America in a way that no president has ever had the courage to do before. Thank you for putting America first. America is with you. You know, I don't think he was referring to America Ferrera there. Meanwhile, you have Keith Kellogg responding to Marco Rubio's tweet, X post. Mr. Secretary, was honored to be with POTUS and the Vice President, and you in the Oval Office today during the bilateral with President Zelensky. As the President has always done, he stood for America. America first. The world saw it today in real time. That being said, I think it is worth getting a broader perspective here. And I'm going to preface this by saying that I think body language is incredibly overrated, and I think a lot of the conversation that you'll see about body language as it relates to international relations is completely ridiculous. So this is very out of character for me, but I want to point to 2 meetings that took place in February that were very high profile and came from 2 key Trump officials, Rubio and Hegseth. If you looked at how the online conversation took place about those 2 things, you would think that the Trump administration was very enthusiastic to be sitting down to a bilateral meeting between the United States and Russia. Very excited and happy about having negotiations finally taking place between those two countries. And in contrast, you would think that Hegseth was on some sort of murder spree inside of Europe and was upset with everyone there. Okay, well, let's look at a couple of photos from those meetings. And bear in mind that these were not cherry-picked, these were the general sentiments at those meetings. You have Hegseth at NATO headquarters, and he was all smiles. He was having very frank conversations about what the security environment would look like and the distribution of effort for the United States versus Europe, but he was doing it with smiles. Meanwhile, over at that bilateral summit between the United States and Russia, what do we have? We have Marco Rubio, who looks like he is trying to paint himself to make him have as large of a frown on his face as is humanly possible. He is trying to make it look like he is very displeased to be there and doing an active effort to have that appearance. So to be clear, I do not think it is worth overanalyzing either of these two photos, but I do think it is interesting that the way that the public perception and the media narrative and the conversation online was taking place, it seemed like the officials at this meeting, the bilateral summit, were very excited to be there, and Hegseth was very upset to be at NATO headquarters, and the way that they were actually presenting themselves was completely the opposite of that. You talk about watching what leaders do instead of listening to what they say. Here we go again. And on Monday, the United States voted with Russia on the UN resolution about Ukraine. To what degree is this doing? Does it hold any significance except symbolism? Well, this was notable because actually political scientists try to estimate state ideology based on those UN General Assembly votes. So I do know a fair bit about what goes on in the General Assembly and what ideology looks like among the countries that vote there. And this was very bizarre. You have Russia that has slowly been drifting to one end of the ideological spectrum ever since Putin came to power. And you have the United States, and Israel for that matter, that have been very firmly on the other side of this political spectrum. Oh, and I guess I should point out that the way that these things are estimated are just like how you've seen maybe estimates of US senators or members of Congress, the way that you look at their votes and you try to judge their ideology on a spectrum. It's literally the same sort of mathematical models that you can use for both US ideology and UN ideology. With the United States, we have a better understanding about what left versus right looks like on an ideological spectrum and what that actually means. In the United Nations, it's more along the lines of Western liberal order and values over those sorts of policies in the world. So what that ends up looking like is you have North Korea all the way on one end of the spectrum, Russia, again, drifting that way, and then on the other end of the spectrum, you have the United States and Israel. And in this particular instance, you had North Korea, Russia, Israel, the United States, and a bunch of others too, but those are the main ones I think worth pointing out right now, all voting in the same way. And I think there is some humor there in that this is starting to look more like the horseshoe theory of politics, which is something else that goes on in the United States, where members of the very, very left wing and members of the very, very right wing oftentimes end up voting similarly. Well, we had that at the General Assembly. But as for the question about whether this holds significance except for symbolism, I think it is basically symbolism. What matters here is how this is reflecting what the United States is actually doing, and that's the more important concern for Ukraine as well as Europe. More specifically, General Assembly votes don't actually hold weight under the vast majority of the things that they can vote on. This isn't like a United Nations Security Council resolution that does have the force of, and I'm going to use air quotes here, the force of law to it. General Assembly votes are more along the lines of just expressing your political preference, which is why they are useful for political scientists trying to estimate ideology. But in terms of actual significance to this, no, it was just a reflection of what was already going on. The minerals deal, or I guess the former minerals deal, we'll see how that goes, had lip service to security guarantees on the table. What are the odds that there is a lot more going on there? This is another one of the things that I think the conversation has been relatively poor about. Security guarantees are not worth much. They can be, but not because you have written down on a piece of paper that there is a security guarantee. That's not what makes a security guarantee valuable. Security guarantees are only useful insofar as they are self-enforcing, getting back to that notion of credibility, that when push comes to shove, you actually want to follow through on that promise of a security guarantee. To just have a security guarantee written down on a piece of paper, sure, it might have a marginal effect, it might drive some level of political conversation going on in a particular country, that, hey, this is a commitment we made, hey, we need to honor our word, But that's going to be relatively marginal as compared to actually taking physical steps that make you want to intervene because it is in your own self-interest to intervene. And that ties into why Article 5 works. Article 5 does not work because the North Atlantic Treaty wrote on a piece of paper that an attack on one is an attack on all. That's not why other countries believe it. It's not because of the piece of paper. It is because NATO, as an organization, takes active steps to try to integrate both economically and militarily so that the countries involved are going to internalize the losses of other countries involved and then make them want to intervene on the behalf of a country that has been attacked. So if you want a security guarantee to work, and moreover for others to actually believe that you're going to follow through on them, you need to create an incentive structure that is going to follow through. And one thing that perhaps the minerals deal may have been doing to some degree is to create a level of economic interdependence between the United States and Ukraine. I think that was a starting point, but if you really want to ramp up the level of credibility of US intervention, and this applies to Europe as well, there needs to be higher levels of economic integration and perhaps military integration between the two. And as a final point here, I don't think the military part is all that crazy. Ukraine has more experience fighting modern warfare than anyone else, and NATO could learn a lot from that. How does the last few weeks of diplomacy relate to your video about Ukraine's hidden leverage, and whether this can still be valid or has been entirely undermined by what Trump's team has done, rather than said? I think it is 100% still true. I think it is 100% still not being exploited, and we will see what actually happens when the lines are getting drawn. All of this is going to have to be answered in a couple of weeks or perhaps longer. Put differently, the theory is right, and it is a fairly basic point from the perspective of an academic who works in the crisis bargaining literature. But the question still remains again, does the United States or the Trump administration care about that part, or do they just want this thing to end because, once more, it's China, China, China? And if the answer is the United States doesn't really care about where the line is being drawn, then there's nothing to exploit because the United States doesn't care to exploit it. Can you foresee this spurring NATO countries without nuclear deterrence into developing their own nuclear weapons programs, since the United States can no longer be relied upon as an ally? I am sure we're going to hear a lot of talk about that, but in terms of actual doing, I'm not as confident. Nuclear weapons are incredibly expensive and very time-consuming to construct. So that already rules out a bunch of countries that don't want to spend the money on it, and then you're going to have another set of countries that will wager that the next US president will be a return to normalcy, and so spending all of the money trying to construct a nuclear weapon isn't going to do much if the United States just returns to the status quo in a few years' time. As a result, I think the two countries you are most likely to hear about this are Germany and Poland. Germany, because it's a big country that can absorb the economic impact of trying to build a nuclear weapon, and Poland because it finds itself in the stickiest of the security situations. But there's still France and the United Kingdom, both as nuclear-armed European countries, and so you'll see both in Germany and Poland, or wherever else there might be a conversation about building nuclear weapons, the point is going to be raised. You can always call up London, you can always call up Paris, and ask them about what's going on with their nuclear weapons, and how their nuclear weapons might still support you in the event of some sort of Russian invasion or anything of the sort. Why do Americans still think they're sending bags of cash to Ukraine, when pretty much all of the money spent in aid goes to American companies? I think part of it is because the public is just not informed about the situation, which is true about a lot of different issues. This is not unique in that regard. And partially it's because there are some people out there that are informed of that and still find it concerning that the money is being spent on weapons. And that is not a wholly unreasonable point. Every dollar that is spent on weapons is a dollar that's not being spent on something else. Even if you're thinking to yourself, well, it's an American job that the aid is supporting, so it's not that big of a deal. It could still be the case that you could spend that money on an American employment program that's going to create something that is productive rather than destructive. Or alternatively, you don't spend that money at all and can therefore lower tax burdens. Now, that's not to say that the United States is getting a bad return on its investment, just to say that there are individuals who are fully informed and just don't have the political preference to want to spend that money. Do you still believe that Trump is a rational man pretending to be irrational? This was a common comment on the video from earlier this week. Have you seen what he's done? Obviously, he's irrational. Come on. But I think that misses the point of the video. The entire strategy behind the madman theory is that a rational actor behaves in a way that makes him appear irrational, so that outside observers think that he is irrational. So for us as outside observers to see something that looks irrational and then use that information to conclude that that individual is irrational, well, it could again just be a rational individual trying to bluff in that direction. So I don't know, you don't know, we collectively don't know, and that's the entire point. Is it actually an American saying that Trump gave javelins and Obama gave sheets? What are sheets in this context? Well, for some context for the listener, this is an actual exchange that took place in the Oval Office. I don't think that it is a saying. I have never heard of that before, but I understood immediately what he was saying. Obama only gave non-lethal aid to Ukraine following the Russian annexation of Crimea in 2014. So what Sheets is referring to here from Trump is, I suppose, the non-lethal aid that Obama was giving. In contrast, Trump was the first president to oversee lethal aid to Ukraine in the form of javelins that shoot tanks. So, weird saying, yes, but it did actually refer to something that had true meaning. Maybe what Trump was going for here is that he thinks that Obama did not give two sheets about Ukraine. What's your favorite soap flavor? Bizarre Times ask for bizarre questions. Over the years, I got to be quite a connoisseur of soap. Though my personal preference was for Lux, I found that Palmolive had a nice, piquant after-dinner flavor. Heavy, but with a touch of mellow smoothness. Lifebuoy, on the other hand, yuck! That's all for me today. Hope to see you on Sunday over on the main channel, when we finally find out who this mystery leader is that I spoke to. Take care.